Javier, when you saw what Alvim said and the fact that he'd been sacked, were you actually, in a way, surprised? Because I've just said that Bolsonaro doesn't seem to care what anybody thinks.
He was sacked because he was found out. He wouldn't have done that. He still keeps within his team of ministers and advisors people who hold far-right sort of ideas. I have the example of Felipe Martins, for example, who is one of his top advisors on foreign policies, who is an admirer of Francisco Franco, the former Spanish dictator. He's many times quoted Franco as one of his heroes. You have Roberto Alvim, who is in charge of culture, who is a religious fanatic, who has insulted the opposition, calling them cockroaches. You have even a black Brazilian advisor called Sergio Nascimento de Camargo, who is a culture advisor, who has called some of black artists to go back to the Congo, even though he is black himself. And he's actually said that slavery was good for Brazil, even though, again, that he is an Afro-Brazilian person. Also, you have the Minister of Education, Abraham Wainwright, who has been committing serious crimes of misspelling in tweets. The problem with him is that he's the education minister, and many academics worry that a person who has such level of education will not have a vision for an education system in Brazil. And if the vision is far right, he's one of the top ideologues of the government of Bolsonaro, then many academics fear that this is going to be a problem. You mentioned the fires in the Amazon. He blamed NGOs for setting those fires, which was an absurd accusation. And he even blamed Leonardo DiCaprio, the actor, for being involved in this kind of activities, which is not the case. Now, I would like to, I was reading an article written by Petra Costa. Petra Costa is a very famous filmmaker who was making an issue that Steve Bannon is an admirer. Steve Bannon, the former far-right, extreme-right advisor of President Donald Trump. He's an admirer of Bolsonaro, and he has accused people who oppose Mr. Bolsonaro of being globalist, which is a term that the extreme right uses in the US to attack people on the center or the left. So we're talking about, and the problem didn't start now. It started almost from the moment Mr. Bolsonaro took office in January, when his son Flavio was allegedly linked to death squads that operated in Rio de Janeiro. He hired two relatives of the top leader of one of the death squads that operate in Rio de Janeiro, and he's expressed views that any kind of protests like the one we have seen in Latin America, like Ecuador or Chile or other countries, should be treated the same way the dictatorship treated these protests. So this is a year of constant attacks on his enemies, of inventing enemies that don't exist, communists that don't exist, and coming up with very far-right policies. And that is really worrying because, according to Petra Costa, there's been an increase in 20% of police killings, and the new Minister of Justice, Mora, who was the attorney, the prosecutor who wanted to prosecute Lula da Silva, the former president of the Workers' Party, for corruption. He was found out that he was making political points in relation to this, and he said that he's trying to issue a law, sanction a law which will enable to reduce penalties for policemen who commit manslaughter during the work. So we're talking about a series of measures and people involved in this government, which makes it very, very dangerous for Latin America, because Brazil is the biggest economy in Latin America. It has a great deal of influence in the region, and these extreme policies could be a threat for the democratic process in Brazil.
Javier, I believe I've lived on 4 continents, and nowhere more than Latin America have I encountered a bigger division between left and right. Since the dictatorships of dictatorships of previous decades ended around the 1980s, all those democracies have flip-flopped between left and right. But the division seems to be increasing. I kind of want, because you mentioned about Latin America and the dangers that Bolsonaro poses to Latin America, I'll just read you this one quote. You gave me a lot of quotes. I'll give you one back. It's from the journalist Mauro Ventura. He says, "Say whatever you like about Bolsonaro, one has to recognize his rare talent of choosing the most unqualified, lunatic and or dangerous people for jobs." And you've given us so many quotes of his individual junior ministers who have said quite incredible things. The black minister for the Cultural Foundation, Sergio Nascimento, that you mentioned, he has called some of Brazil's best-known black artists parasites of the black race. So how much does Latin America assimilate what's coming out of Bolsonaro's government and take it for themselves in their own countries?
One of the problems Latin America has, Adnan, is that racism is quite rife in Latin America. And many people don't think that racism is racism. That is one of the problems we have had in our continent. This could encourage people in other countries to come up with statements like this and to discriminate the minorities, black minorities, indigenous peoples, for example. You mentioned this swing between left and right in Latin America, what happened in Bolivia, for example, where Evo Morales had to leave, and the repression against indigenous people has increased a great deal by this new government that took office. And in Argentina, the left is back in power. So we're talking about a turmoil in Latin America where you have this swing between left and right, which is very, but in the case of Brazil, yes, they could influence other people thinking in the country, thinking that they can get away with this kind of policy.
Sorry, I have to stop you, but I really, really appreciate your coming onto the program. And the reason I have to stop Javier